Howdy, you delicious people. I'm here today to view Star Trek First Contact. So, I know that this movie may not be the perfect one to start off doing Star Trek on this channel, but the reason why I wanted to go on and do this movie compared to so many others is because, first off, this movie goes on and gives us the very first time ever that Earth was to have gone on and had a warp drive spaceship, as well as also this movie has the villainous Borg in it, which to me, in all honesty, like the Borg is the most fascinating creative thing in Star Trek whatsoever. Whenever I was to go on and watch Star Trek episodes, I would always hope that there'd be the Borg involved in it because of how interesting they were and how it seemed that the stakes of the episode had gotten a lot higher than normal other things. Maybe Klingons were always really interesting to me, or maybe occasionally there'd be like a Ferengi episode or a Kardashian episode that was to go on and be unique for Star Trek, but I always go back to Borg and find them to be the most fascinating thing. So, my also interest in this movie is based on a person who is to be emotionally compromised and wanting their revenge. We would go on to see at some points Star Trek characters eventually have that same feeling portrayed in films. Like, of course, we'd have Spock, who ends up getting emotionally compromised because he loses Vulcan. We end up having Kirk, who is to be emotionally compromised when he's driven crazed by Khan screaming out his name, and emotionally compromised when his son is to be killed by Klingons and he no longer trusts them. We have Data, who in Generations, I believe it's Generations, is to have gotten emotionally compromised because of a chip being put into his body, and he is unable to rescue Geordi because of fear, and he eventually has issues just kind of doing his daily tasks because he cannot control this chip and needs to figure out a way to just manage his feelings. Towards the end of the movie, out of all the wreckage of the Enterprise when it does crash, he goes on and finds Spot and cries and asks Troy if this is the right emotion to be having at this moment. And Troy's like, oh no, you're fine. Like, this is the right emotion. So, we make our way into Star Trek First Contact, and the emotionally compromised person is to be none other than the starship's own captain, Jean-Luc Picard. We come to find that Picard is still haunted by the Borg, having nightmares and being basically the equivalent of a character that has gone through so many kind of horrors in his life that he becomes such a man that kind of is to be the expert and is to like know how to get around the Borg when they of course are to arrive. He knows their weaknesses. He knows how to strategically beat them, and he will be driven to do so regardless of what anyone goes on and tells him. And that becomes really interesting in this film. It becomes to the point to where no friend of Picard will convince him that he is, of course, compromised, that he just wants to go on and murder all of the Borg for what they did to him, because since they hurt him, he wants to hurt them back. And so it takes somebody that is not Picard's friend, because even Worf tries to convince Picard that they should pull back here, that they should blow up the ship, and Picard just kind of pushes Worf aside, just calls him a coward, and there was almost a point where they were going to fight right then and there on the bridge, and it's such an amazing scene. But so it takes an outsider like Lily to come in to talk to Picard and convince him what he really should be doing. That he is to have gone on and smiled while murdering this Borg and enjoyed it. And how he doesn't look at the Borg like a prior coworker. It's just, no, it's the Borg now. That's all that matters. There's no saving this person who has turned to the Borg now. It's too late for them. And also, Picard goes on and says, yeah, if any of your crewmen are to turn into a Borg, kill them because you're doing them a favor. So again, it takes an outsider to convince Picard, who doesn't know him that well and isn't his friend, to say blow up the damn ship, and then he does. Because Lily had to, interestingly enough, come up with just some way of talking to Picard that the light bulb finally goes on, and he realizes what he's doing, and goes back into the bridge to say, yeah, you know what, I was wrong. And goes back to Worf and basically apologizes. So it's also really interesting within these Star Trek films to also see Data kind of turn on the ship. We would also see in a later film where Data would go on and seem to malfunction, and both Worf and Patrick will have to come in, or Picard will come in, and need to remind Data that they are to be his friends by going on and singing this song of this boxer song, this knockdown blow, and what have you. Also, it's so interesting for the way that this third act plays out to really strengthen the relationship of both Data and Picard, for how eventually both Picard and Data become assimilated into the Borg, and how they can hear one another's thoughts, and how eventually that does go on and carry into shows like Picard, where Picard cannot just let Data go. Especially with the way within the Star Trek films, how eventually Picard is to have been the last one to have seen Data alive. If you can call Data an android being alive. And so there is also some things about this very specific film that I think does have very much an impact on Star Trek in general. We go on, and we of course have the Zefram Cochrane thing that does tie back into Star Trek Enterprise, and they have to kind of show the first steps after the whole Zefram Cochrane thing and the very first ever Enterprise and the early stages of that. Then we also go on to have the Borg Queen being introduced in this movie, which carries on into other things. It ends up getting reused in Star Trek Voyager, as well as also certain things from Star Trek Voyager being in this. Like we have the hologram doctor, which has his little scene here, and some stuff from Voyager starts to kind of slip in. We see that Worf is transitioning from Defiant of Deep Space Nine to come back to work alongside his Star Trek friends. And we also talk about the Queen Borg, and the Queen Borg is to also be involved in things like also Picard, the later show that reties in so much of this stuff. Reties in Star Trek Next Generation, reties in all these movies and everything else. That kind of just brings back all this stuff from the forefront, because all of this stuff is to now be available on Paramount Plus anyways, so you might as well just kind of hit everything to get people reinterested into the Star Trek product by Picard, because there is now a library of all this stuff existing upon Paramount Plus. So they're bringing back like Seven of Nine, who is also a Borg character and had so much involvement in Voyager, and but again, it kind of reconnects us with the Borg Queen being involved in that show because of Seven of Nine. Anyways, so with that said, I thought Star Trek First Contact was to be so epic to me just because of the Borg and how they were to go on and try to strategically fight the Borg off, because eventually the Borg have these shields being put on them, so they have to figure out how to hand-to-hand combat take them down, and how guys like Data and Worf have to use their strength and take them down that way, which just makes for a much more interesting film than the crewmen having to go on and just phaser and compression rifle everybody, because that does eventually just kind of get boring and kind of stale. But also, when the weapons become of no use and how they're shooting blanks, we then go on and realize that this situation is probably going to be none other than just hopeless. And that's, of course, when they get to the ultimate goal of like, well, hey, if we kill the ship, we kill the Borg. Because eventually, the Borg goes from the Borg cube to the Borg sphere, and then the invasion of the Borg ship onto the Enterprise. So, because they teleport to the ship while their shields are down. Anyway, so, which is kind of fascinating, and I honestly wish that kind of situation would have happened a lot more, where villains would just go on and just teleport because shields are down and they were caught unaware. Because again, it just kind of makes for a little bit more interesting of episodes and show and what have you. So it is quite interesting also, like the stuff that they don't have in this movie as far as sets are concerned, because it's like, okay, they didn't show the teleporter room whatsoever in this entire film. There are certain sections of this movie that seems to be, of course, fairly limited. But when you also look at it, like, of course, they're going to consistently figure out a way to bring up engineering. They're consistently bringing up the bridge because, of course, the bridge is to be, of course, a vital kind of battle station kind of place to always focus on. And then eventually they have like the med bay or the doctor's room. I'm not quite sure exactly what that thing is. I'm gonna just keep calling it the med bay and hope that everybody understands what I mean by that. Because eventually, because everybody is starting to be wounded and everyone is to be fighting against the Borg, that yeah, they have to focus on that also. Anyways, so kind of getting lost in the weeds here. With that said, like if you don't have Paramount Plus working, go on and watch this film if you are to be still interested in it, as well as also interested in Star Trek in general. I would go on besides Paramount Plus and give you apps to where you can watch a lot of Star Trek for absolutely free, especially if you're going on and wanting to check out the current product, which is Starfleet Academy, which a lot of people have kind of written off, but that seems to also be a popular thing to talk about. I would go on and give you apps like Clede Plus, KLEDE Plus. You can go on and check out Star Trek, a number of things there. And if you have a Google Play Store, if you have a mobile device, I would recommend like a tablet or an iPad because that's to be a big enough screen to where you can go on and watch this stuff instead of just watching it on a phone. It's a little bit different that way. So, going on to then also recommend Movie Box 3. Movie Box 3 will be on the Google Play Store. I checked both of this stuff yesterday, so it should be still available for you to search it and find it. The number 3 won't be on the title, but eventually, if you just say Movie Box 3, eventually it'll be the kind of the early one that pops up. So you should probably be able to check out some Star Trek stuff there. If anything, beyond that, I'm sure I can go on and recommend a number of other apps for you to check out also, but those are kind of to be the easy ones, the go-to ones. So with that said, I think it's about that time to just push on into full-on breakdown, full-on spoilers, and full-on just talking about this film scene for scene, blow for blow. I know that this movie is going to be a hefty amount of detail, so I'm going to try to skim through this movie as best I can, but there's probably also going to be a lot of times where I go on and I go way too deep into dialogue because I feel that I need to, but I'm going to try and just skip through this movie as best I can to go in and talk about it. So also, I'm going to tee this movie up right here, right now, to give you kind of the cliff notes of it. So, if you want to feel avoided of spoilers, kind of maybe not check this out and check out the movie. So, because this is kind of the cliff notes part, but it's not revealing the whole, every bit of detail of all this movie. So, the beginning of this starts with Picard having a nightmare where he's wearing the Star Trek Next Generation uniform, and he wakes up eventually to find out that the Admiral wants the Enterprise to not get involved in a war that's going on with the Borg at Earth. Picard eventually goes on to adhere to the Admiral, even though everyone else in the Enterprise is kind of upset about that. So the Enterprise goes on and goes to the neutral zone and does nothing until they're on the radio, they're on the frequency of the Borg battle. And Picard goes on to go against orders and fight the Borg, finding out the exact weakness of the Borg and exploiting it, and then finding out that the Borg has gone on to use some time travel vortex that the Enterprise is just coincidentally following into. Because they've realized that the Earth has now been taken over by the Borg in the past. So they go back in time to try and stop the Borg to blow up the Borg spear, but the Borg have teleported onto the Enterprise and are now invading the Enterprise and trying to assimilate the Enterprise to assimilate Earth. So we have some of the crew before communications end up getting cut off from the Enterprise make their way onto Earth to try and help Zefram Cochrane, because of course his missile silo and his ship Phoenix was to have gone on and been attacked. So they need to go on and go through the process of fixing Zefram Cochrane's ship and both missile silo place or whatever to go on and be able to have Zefram Cochrane have his ship go off as planned, so that way they can signal the Vulcans, so they can have first contact. So, because this changes like the next 50 years for Earth and life in general. So we would have Picard that goes on to be the only one that knows what's going on his ship as it's starting to get invaded. And it all comes down to environmental changes and temperature changes. And Picard goes on to know, because he can hear the song of the Borg, that the Borg are still alive. Come to find out, as the Borg go on and take over engineering and start to kill a lot of crewmen there, eventually this is all to lead to Picard and Worf with their security teams to try and get to engineering and having problems getting into it, and then eventually facing off the Borg because of that, and people end up getting taken, data ends up getting taken, and ends up getting put into engineering, and ends up getting manipulated by the Queen Borg by given flesh and skin and almost being assimilated. But Data is to go on and consistently convince the Queen Borg that he is to be very much different than them, and consistently argues with her about the Borg not being perfect and that they're delusional thinking so, and on we go on this movie. With the argument between both Data and Queen Borg, and eventually even the Queen Borg basically having sex with Data, and Data always going on and saying like, well, I'm fully functional and many different techniques. Because he goes on and he always says that every time any woman is to ever go on and ask Data if he has ever slept with anybody before, and because he's done it with Tara, the girl who died in Next Gen. Spoilers for anybody who hasn't seen Next Generation. But anyways, yeah, she dies, and then she has this very special moment with Data. it's okay. She'll end up getting like a clone of herself. She'll end up being some other character later on, and they'll bring her back because of how just beloved technically that character was. So they go on and they create her as some other person. So we go on in this movie, and eventually this is all to lead for Picard to rescue Data and eventually let all his people kind of evacuate the ship for him to alone face off against the Queen Borg and try to convince Data to be on his side instead of the Borg's. And eventually this all ends up with the strategic move of these coolant tanks that are to be by the warp core that they have to go on and break to eventually hope that this can do well enough to kill the Borg in engineering, because they're having problems going on and being able to figure out how to use anything else to take them down. So, with that said, yeah, let's push on into full-on spoilers of this movie, because I've already kind of gone into way too detail of this freaking film anyways. So I think it's about that time to, of course, go on and pause here and go for scene, blow for blow, and get into more nitty-gritty details. So with that said, I'm going to pause this here and then go on and have this movie all to be replayed out. Oh, because it is spoiler time, it's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. Let me know in the comments below what is to be your favorite Star Trek thing, what is to be your favorite Star Trek season, Star Trek title. I don't know exactly what to call that. It's kind of like Power Rangers, how they have like different kinds of like seasons within the series, and they all have different titles, and some are separate from the rest of the show, and some of them like connect with one another, and they have crossovers and all kinds of things. So so with that said, let me know what is to be your favorite Star Trek title, Star Trek thing, because maybe at some point I may go on and possibly review it. Maybe some people are interested in Star Trek Academy. Maybe some people are even interested in Star Trek Lower Decks for whatever goofy reason. Uh, but if anything, I would like to also review like the good part of Star Trek. I know me personally, I would say that I probably had grew up with Star Trek Next Generation, and that would probably be a really interesting thing to just kind of jump off at, if none other. But I think a lot of people have their own, when they think of Star Trek, they have their own either jumping on point or they have their favorites, and I can understand that. So, with that said, let's pause this here. Let's whip this stuff out. All right, so the way that this movie starts out would hope that a lot of people had seen Star Trek Next Generation and understand the connection they're trying to make here. Because in the very beginning of this film, we come to find Picard, who's in the regeneration, a Clobe, which is basically just a charging station for the Borg. And Picard is in it in the next gen red suit. And he is to be whispered of "We are the Borg," that I am Locutus of the Borg, the resistance is futile. And the next thing we see is Picard turning into Locutus, who, of course, during Star Trek Next Generation, we had Picard that had to go on and bargain with the Borg to save the Enterprise, or to just to try to bargain with the Borg to get assimilated. And Locutus ends up coming out of this, and Locutus then goes on and attacks the Enterprise. And so the Enterprise has to go on and figure out a way to free Locutus, and then in turn turn Locutus back into Picard, so they can go on and get their captain back. So the next thing we see is Picard waking up and making his way to his bathroom to wash himself off with this sink that has water in it. I say that because I think at some points it is kind of strange that like Star Trek still has water coming from a sink and stuff like that. Simply because I have gone on and watched like Star Trek Voyager, where a character would go on and take a shower, and even like the shower doesn't seem to be like a normal shower. It's kind of strange. So Picard goes on and looks at himself in the mirror, and then all of a sudden he realizes that the Borg pieces of him are starting to come back to the surface, and Picard freaks out. Picard then wakes up again, because we just have him going from dream to dream to dream here. And Picard ends up getting waked up by a computer that is going on and telling Picard that that the Admiral wants to go on and speak to him. So Picard makes his way to this laptop and talks to the Admiral, and it's to make him concerned that there is a disturbing report going on in Deep Space Five. The Admiral within this meeting will go on, Admiral Hayes, and tell Picard that he does not want his involvement in it. And eventually Picard will tell Riker in more detail why that is, saying that Picard is a much more unstable factor if Picard goes against the Borg. So that is to, of course, be the reasoning for why Picard is going to be sent to the neutral zone, hoping that there's going to be some action there against the Romulans, even though there really isn't. And there hasn't been for quite a while. So Picard goes into his captain's log and then makes his way to the bridge, or makes his way to the room where they have this long stretch of table, where at some points in the show they have people who are to debate things and have to make clear consensuses based on all the highest up characters of each regime of the ship. So, and I'm not quite sure exactly what this room actually is, because I know there is like the captain's room. I know there's like ready rooms, and like I know there is this room. So if anybody knows the name specifically of this exact room, because I know there is a specific room name of it, because it's been so long since actually watching Star Trek stuff besides this thing, let me know in the comments below. So, because I know this is a room that consistently happens in Star Trek Next Gen. So, Picard is to lay out what Admiral Hayes had told them to do, and also the attack that is going on with the Borg. Eventually, guys like Geordi chime in, and eventually they go on to say how ready the ship is, and also Data goes on and says, like, if they are to go on and warp to Earth, because that's where the attack is heading, how long it would take them to get there, or take them 3 hours, X number of minutes, and so on and so forth. So Picard does go on and hear everybody out, but he also just tells them, hey, this is our orders. We can't argue with them, so this is just what we're going to do. We're going to just make our way to the neutral zone. So they make their way to the neutral zone, and Riker goes on to speak with Picard, I think, in his captain's quarters. Because again, like, these rooms are a little bit, tiny bit different than, of course, the show. And plus, also, this is a completely different Enterprise compared to the show's Enterprise that I'm used to seeing. Because, of course, the Star Trek Enterprise that I'm used to seeing was to have been destroyed on another film. And eventually, we go on into other Enterprises that have different letters, and because that just consistently happens because these ships consistently just get destroyed. So, Riker goes on and is to talk to Picard, and Picard, in more detail, tells Riker what the Admiral had said about him, and Riker tells Picard about how he's the perfect man for the job to take on the Borg. And Picard wants to agree with Riker, but also there's a possibility that the Admiral could probably be right as well. So the bridge ends up calling Captain Picard to it, and so both Riker and both Picard make their way there. So they make their way to the bridge to overhear the frequency of the Borg battle. So eventually there are ships like Defiant and Bozeman. Defiant, of course, had been tied into Deep Space Nine, and eventually in the later halves of Deep Space Nine, there are some times where they would just focus on Deep Space Nine, and then at some points they would just focus on Defiant, and a Voyager would go on and have their own little ship that they would kind of end up doing the same thing, and that started to get really effing annoying when they would do that. Maybe people liked those episodes, maybe people liked those things. If anything, I liked it where, like, the Defiant, I think, did have a lot more action than I think Deep Space Nine did. Fair? Like, yeah. But also, I would have liked a little bit more of like, hey, like, yeah, the Defiant can go on and do what it's doing, but try to keep it with Deep Space Nine. Try to give it more of like a back and forth instead of just one full episode that focuses on the Defiant. Like, I would have liked a little bit more 50-50 booking there, but I guess that's just me. Probably. As well as also, like, when they went on and they focused on a certain number of people in Voyager instead of going on and focusing back on the Voyager ship, yeah, like, it kind of felt like you were getting shortchanged, in my opinion, with just a smaller ship with a smaller bit of crew. It just felt shortchanged, and I hated that. Eventually, also, there would be certain episodes where people would go on to shuttles, and that's how they would just write a number of people off and just focus on certain characters, which I didn't hate those episodes. I thought those episodes were interesting. But again, also, like, people could have felt shortchanged by that. So, anyways. So the Enterprise is going on and overhearing the frequency of this battle. And the further and further that the Borg is basically tearing through Starfleet Enterprise, or Starfleet Federation ships, that's what I wanted to say there. Eventually, we have Picard that ends up informing the crew that he's going to go on and go against their orders, and he's curious if anybody has to disagree with him. It seems that everyone is to be dead silent, and eventually Data is to be the only one that is willing to chime in here. Data turns to Picard and tells him, you know what, I can speak with everybody, to say that to hell with our orders, let's go. So Picard is like, all right, maximum warp, let's get out of here so we can go on and help these guys out. Because it's the right thing to do. Engage, mother. So, we now see the Borg cube. We see the Defiant. Worf and one of his crewmen, because I don't know Defiant that well, to know if this guy had been on Deep Space Nine, or if they just got some random guy. I don't really quite remember, because it's been so long since seeing Deep Space Nine. So, the Defiant, it seems, is having their main power go offline, and at this point, only thing that is really left is just their life support, because their shields are completely down, and so Worf goes on and says, all right, this may be a perfect time to die. Maybe we should have ramming speed to ram into the ship to maybe take it out that way, because if we're going to die, we might as well do that. The crewman informs Worf that if anything, there is a ship making their way to help them out. Reinforcements have come, and it's none other than the Enterprise. So as the Enterprise comes flying in, facing off against the Borg, Picard ends up needing an update on the Defiant's life support, and to realize that the ship is still kind of to be afloat, but they need to get the people out of there for safety reasons. So Picard goes on and alerts the teleport room to receive the Defiant people, the survivors, safely aboard. And so after that, they can go on and focus more so on the Borg cube and try to take it down. So they go on screen to look at the Borg cube and see how much damage it's taken. Picard goes on and is to let Data know an exact point to fire upon, and is to have a hailing frequency to let all the ships know to attack that same area also. Data goes on and tells Picard that that exact place is not a vital thing of the cube, and Picard would disagree. Like, Picard is telling Data, trust me, I know what I'm saying. I know this ship very well. So Data entrusts Picard, and they go on and they fire with their phasers. They fire upon the phasers. All these ships join in with their torpedoes or their phasers, whatever they have at their disposal, to attack that area. And the Borg cube does blow up, and a Borg sphere comes from outside of it as it completely blows up and annihilates the cube. So Picard notices the Borg sphere and wants them to engage it and wants to follow it and pursue it. And Picard alerts Hawk to do so. Hawk is the new guy that is just in this movie, and eventually he ends up going on and getting killed because he's basically the equivalent of a red shirt, sadly. But hey, for this guy to get involved in any Star Trek bit of content, yeah, like, good on this guy for just being involved in it. Because yeah, like the IP of this thing and how it's just gone on forever, yeah, it's just incredible. So after Picard tells Hawk to engage, he all of a sudden can hear the Borg speak. And Troy ends up kind of getting up and like, Picard, are you okay? And Picard alerts Troy that he can hear them. He can hear the Borg. He can hear their song. So Beverly and Worf make their way to the bridge. And this is kind of a bit of comedy here, because I love how in Star Trek, especially the films, but also occasionally in the show, they have a very good, well balance of there being really good comedy and serious moments. And this is the point where they go on, and even when they're in like somewhat of a battle, they are trying to crack jokes here. So Worf comes in and they welcome him aboard the Enterprise, and they start talk about the Defiant, about how it's a little ship, and they want him, Worf, involved in tactical again, like back to what he was normally doing on the Enterprise when he was there. Riker turns to Worf and ends up asking him, "Hey, you don't know how to fire phasers, right?" And Worf looks at him like, whatever. It's not that hard. It's just hitting buttons. So Data finds out that there's something unique going on with the sphere, and it's all of a sudden turning into some temporal vortex, which basically means that the Borg sphere is now time traveling. And the Enterprise is caught up in this vortex also. The Enterprise all of a sudden notices, within caught in this thing and forced to follow it, that they all of a sudden notice that Earth has drastically changed. That all of a sudden Earth has now been infested with the Borg and has drastically changed, so much so that the Enterprise has to go through this time travel vortex also to try and correct it, because the Borg had gone on to the past to destroy the Earth and assimilate it. So we now go on to 2063. Zefram Cochrane and Lily have made their way to a bar, possibly to regret the decisions that they've made for how drunk that they are. Walking off the bar, Lily is talking about regrets, and Zefram is like, well, that's the thing about me. I don't have regrets. So Lily all of a sudden notices something in outer space, and all Zefram notices is the constellation Leo. But as something is moving around in the vast of space, they find out that that thing is to have weapons upon it and is starting to torpedo through the Earth, forcing Zephyrin and Lily to run like hell. And Lily is stating that they need to make their way to the missile silo to the Phoenix to be protected. And Zephyrin is like, well, fuck the Phoenix. Like, I'm not going on and going there. So, so Zephyrin just kind of hangs out. So, we have a number of people on Earth getting killed and wiped out. And so the Enterprise, now in the past, Data is trying to figure out exactly where they are. Data mentions that they're in the 21st century, and the further and further that Data tries to figure out that it's like right before the Third World War, and eventually figuring out that Picard needs to know the exact date of when this is in Earth's history because it does matter. Picard also is to focus on that there is the Borg sphere and that there's a possibility that they can take quantum torpedoes and destroy it, and so they do. They take the torpedoes, which quantum torpedoes just kind of sounded weird. For me to hear quantum torpedo, when does that ever get used? So the sphere ends up blowing up, and the Enterprise thinks, oh, a crisis averted. So they try to figure out and pinpoint where all the damage is on Earth that the Borg had gone on to do. And Riker mentions that it's a place in Montana, and it's at a missile complex, and that's where Picard turns to Data and asks exactly what date it is. And it's April 4th, 2063. Picard turns and realizes that this is to impact first contact, that the Vulcans meet up with Earth, because we come to find, and this will relay in other Star Trek films, let alone just this one, we come to find out that planets that can go on and have warp drive abilities don't go on and don't make their way to other planets that don't have that ability. Because, like, it can really very much, like, hurt that planet with a certain amount of technology that is to be so well advanced than them. As well as also, like, that just seems to be like the connecting thing of for whatever reason that has to qualify each planet to then know that that other life is present in the galaxy, the world, the galaxy, the universe, the solar, the whatever, the endless amount of space, so to speak. And eventually, in one of the Star Trek later films with Chris Pine and Carl Urban, they go on and they make their way to a planet and they realize that they have to save Spock. But when saving Spock, they realize that they also have to basically show the Enterprise in order to beam up Spock to save him. And then the planet ends up going on to see the Enterprise and draw the Enterprise onto the ground. and realize how much that this has affected this planet going forward. So Picard goes on to need to put together an away team because there's nothing really going on Earth that would have a fear of the captain leaving the ship. So Picard goes on and gets an away team and tells the computer that they need to they need to have 21st century civilian clothing because they're not going to just go on Earth with their space jumpsuits on and yeah, like it is really interesting in Star Trek how a lot of times these people need to go into disguise instead of just go on and make their way to these places with their Starfleet uniforms on. So, and there's a lot of times where they would even go further and have these like cosmetics to be done and try to look like any number of these people to just do these investigations. So, Picard, Crusher, and Data, and a number of other crewmen make their way onto Earth's surface. They go on to find that the missile silo has left a number of people dead. And Picard goes along with Data into the missile silo for us to realize that the Phoenix ship had originally been a nuclear weapon that had been converted. And they're looking at it, and eventually Picard will even touch it after he goes on and ends up getting attacked by Lily, who has this gun and is firing it off. Picard is trying to convince Lily that he's not there to hurt her, but Lily ends up saying bullshit, and she continues to fire off her gun. Data realizes that he's the perfect person to try to get near Lily because gunfire will not affect him. So Data gives Picard his tricorder and jumps down and ends up getting riddled with bullets, and Data is just like, well, like, okay, whatever. Data just turns to Lily and says, greetings. And it's kind of so consistently funny how Data meets these people, and the very first thing he says is greetings. Even when he's face to face with the Borg Queen, the very first thing he says is greetings. It's so weird. Like how he's so polite, even to bad guys. It's funny. I think, in my opinion. So Data jumps down, gets riddled with bullets, and eventually Lily passes out. We come to find out that there is quite a bit of radiation poisoning going on because there is a radiation leak, and they need to figure out how to fix it. And so Picard calls the engineering and lets them know that there's quite a bit of work to be done to fix this ship, as well as also quite a bit of work to be done to find Zefram Cochrane and to try to get the Phoenix and everything working back in order. And so that is, of course, when LaForge goes on and is talking to Picard and realizes that he needs to leave the ship. But before he does, he goes on and tells one of his crewmen to, like, hey, there is some environmental changes kind of going on, and it seems that the ship is getting really warmer. Like, we need to figure out what's going on here because this just seems kind of strange compared to so many other times of the ship just kind of being at this temperature. And so LaForge leaves thinking that it's just a simple change and there's no crisis to be averted here. So here is where both Picard and Data are touching the ship, the Phoenix. Picard has mentioned how he only as a kid would see this ship in a museum, and he had never been so close to be able to touch it. Data ends up asking Picard if it's important for people to touch it, and Picard is like, "Oh yeah, it is definitely a difference." So Data starts touching it himself, and then just notices the structural part of the ship, and further and further he touches it, he still doesn't quite understand the importance of it, but he touches it anyways. So Troy goes on to alert both Picard and Data that they have yet to find Zefram Cochrane, and that also she feels that maybe she should leave to give the three of them, Phoenix, Picard, and Data, some time alone, which is kind of funny here. So, but also Troy is to mention that there's a possibility that Cochrane could possibly be dead, and Picard is hoping that that is not the truth, because if anything, uh, Zefram is to be the only one that is to be the history-changing character here, and if he is to go on and die, like considering both LaForge and Riker are on the Zefram when it goes off, like them being involved in that ship doesn't quite matter, but having the involvement of Zefram, the guy who is to be in their history books, does change things. So we now go to engineering, and we have a crewman named Paul and some other girl that I don't think has a name here. Paul goes on and makes his way to this shaft. I never quite can remember what that weird uh like tube or tunnel thing that they go into in Star Trek. That may go on and have its own technical name, but I don't know exactly what that's called. So for anybody who is to go on, it'd be Star Trek, of course, um, like diehards, or they just know the ins and outs of the ship. Let me know in the comments below what this kind of just shaft is to be called, or this tube kind of section of the ship is to be called, because eventually there is quite a bit of more of that being used in this movie, as well as also like I just don't know what everything is to be called in the show from memory. So Paul makes his way through this shaft and eventually encounters a Borg and ends up getting killed off screen. We then have the crewman who is with Paul call out for him and makes her way up this ladder. As eventually this crewman is to go on and pop her head to find out where Paul is and if he's still alive, she screams and obviously is to be killed right after Paul. So Picard knows that there's something wrong, and Picard can feel that the Borg is still having a presence, even if it is in a different time period. So Picard calls upon the Enterprise to ask if there's anything unusual going on the ship. Eventually, Worf does answer and explain that there is some environmental changes going on the ship, and that it seems that there is a bit of focus on engineering of possible disturbances. So the more and more that Picard starts to investigate things and hear Worf out, he realizes that he has to go on and make his way back to the ship to try to figure out if what Picard's thinking could possibly be that the Borg has infiltrated his own ship, and to see if there's anything that he can do to reverse that. So we now go on. Oh, sick bay. Sick bay? See, is that it? I'm trying to think if it's medbay or it's sick bay. Let me know in the comments below my proper terms here, because it's such a long time since Star Trek. It has been for me. Like I would go on and see like Star Trek movies. I don't know how many times with my dad because my dad was a fan of this. He owns so much of the stuff from the shows, and like it took me a very long time to cover Star Trek because I just didn't have the costume stuff for it. Uh, as well as also I only have one costume in tow. So eventually, when we get further into other different kinds of Star Trek, I'm going to go on and really very much be uh, kind of not a variety of what I honestly have, but I'm going to just try my best because feasibly, uh, yeah, if people really do like Star Trek, then eventually I hope to go on and at some point get more clothing and more outfits that connect to it. But also, Temu doesn't really even have much of Star Trek stuff. Like, it's kind of getting a little bit of things here and there as I'm continuing to find stuff in Temu that connects with that. So hopefully I'll go on and I'll get more and more stuff at some point, but it might not be anytime soon. So let's push on here. So back with sickbay, Crusher goes on and is to start to notice how it is starting to get hot in the room she's in. So even Crusher goes on and tries to call out to the bridge. The next thing we see is Picard making his way to the bridge, and Worf ends up explaining to Picard what has been going on with the ship. And they haven't exactly quickly narrowed it down that the Borg have invaded yet, but the further and further that Picard ends up asking Hawk and like what is to have gone on with the ship temperature wise, the further and further they break it exactly down, Picard realizes that the degree of the ship is to identically match a normal Borg ship. And that is why that they have the Borg themselves made these adjustments. So Picard tries to call out to Riker on the Earth's surface to get no answer because they find out that the communications have started to get cut off, as well as also some of the computers had started to get cut off also. Picard rushes to Data to say to him to try to get the main computer to be controlled at the bridge so the Borg won't be able to commandeer it and take it over and be able to take control of the ship themselves. As well as also Data is encrypting and making so that the main computer has this code for the Borg to eventually try and hack through it, which will take them too long. And if anything, they actually do just need Data to be able to manipulate him to reverse the encryption. So Picard ends up asking Worf where it seems that the Borg have ended, and it seems that they have ended at Deck 16. So that then has both Picard and Worf realize that they need to go on, and they need to investigate. They need to get security teams and go on to make their way to engineering. So Crusher ends up needing to wake up Lily, and so they realize that Lily is to be completely disoriented and not know what at all is going on here. But they need to wake her up regardless because they need to take her out of sickbay so that way they can get her to safety to another part of the ship because eventually they'll come to find that the Borg are thrusting their way through the sickbay to try to get in. I would go on at some points in the Enterprise and would go on to see that there'd be plenty of times where things would be like crashing through doors, and it's always kind of interesting to see that always happen in Enterprise. Like, I think there was one time where the Enterprise ship started to get infected, and the Enterprise crew members would start turning into all these like monsterish things. Like, I think Barclay ended up turning into a spider once, and eventually there was a point where Worf turns into a monster, and he's like bashing into this door, and Picard is trying to figure out a way to stop Worf, and like that kind of just comes to mind here. So as the sickbay is all going on to evacuate into this shaft here, Crusher is going to realize that she has never gone on to turn on the hologram version of the Doctor from Star Trek Voyager, and so she's going to have to go on and use it now. So, and Crusher says, yeah, I've never used this before, but I guess I'll have to use it here. So Crusher turns on the hologram Doctor, and it's the guy from Star Trek Voyager. Coincidentally, also, this same guy is to also be used in Starfleet Academy, which is kind of cool. But then again, also, I'm like, like, it's Starfleet Academy. I haven't heard good things about it. It's nice that he's there, but also, yeah, it's a show that it seems that when I've kind of heard things about it so far, it hasn't been positive. So, but oh well, it is what it is. If anything, there's so much freaking Star Trek content out there. People can choose and go on to say like, okay, this is my Star Trek, and nothing else is beyond that. There's so many freaking seasons of so many Star Trek shows that, like, it doesn't really matter that there is a modern product of Star Trek, anyways, in my opinion. So, we have the hologram Doctor, who's basically just called Doctor, and Crusher goes on to tell the hologram to become a decoy, to do anything to distract the Borg from following Crusher and her people. And Doctor goes on and tells Crusher, it's like, well, that's not my normal programming. And Crusher is like, well, do whatever. Talk to it. Dance. Do anything just to get its attention. That's all you need to do. So Crusher leaves, and so the Doctor turns to the Borg and is to go on and say, oh, Borg implants can cause severe irritation. Could I recommend some cream for you? So Crusher and her sickbay team make their way through these shafts and through these areas, and Lily ends up separating from them. Now we have Picard that is going on and giving all his team compression rifles, which are just bigger looking phasers. There has been also phaser rifles that honestly do look really goofy, and I honestly like these compression rifles a lot more. When eventually they end up getting used in other things, or they end up getting brought back, I'm like, oh yeah, I liked those. I liked these weapons because they just look a little bit better than the phaser rifles that I would see them use on the show also. Anyways, so Picard tells the team that they're making their way to, of course, engineering, and they need to try to avoid hitting the warp core because that will definitely hurt the ship and eventually cause the ship to explode. So if anything, what they need to try and attack is this coolant tank, which eventually will be the later thing that Data goes on and attacks, so that way uh, the Borg will get killed in the engineering room. So it's kind of foreshadowing to the one thing that they need to get to in engineering. So Worf says that not all of Borg is to be human, and some of it is to actually be machine. And Picard ends up telling Worf, it's like, well, yeah, that is true, but if anything, like, doing this will be just good enough to be able to incapacitate the Borg long enough for them to go on and take them out. So they push on and they make their way through the ship. We now go back to Earth and we have Troi, who's at a bar, and she is now drunk. She is drunk. Because of course she's probably rarely have ever gone on and gotten drunk before, or if she has probably gotten drunk, then maybe not this drunk. So Riker will go on and make his way into the bar and talk to Troi, and Troi will state in a drunken state that she had to go on and drink so much alcohol in order to talk to Sephron to eventually find out that he's the guy that they're looking for, because they don't really know Sephron enough to know what he looks like, even though there are statues of him and all kinds of things. So Riker tries to turn off the music from the jukebox, and Troi will tell him not to. Riker makes, or Zephyr makes his way to Riker and asks who this guy exactly is. So that way we can find out if Riker is to actually be Troy's husband right now. Because I do know eventually that does become a thing. Like Riker and Troy's relationship becomes like this will they won't they kind of thing in Star Trek. As well as also Troi ends up with a number of other people, or other people besides Riker. Eventually I think Troi at some point like does end up even with Worf, which was kind of interesting. But eventually Worf goes on and falls in love with somebody in Deep Space Nine, and they marry. Anyways, so Riker eventually goes on and pulls Troi aside and ends up asking her if Sephron will go on and be able to take the truth if Riker goes on and tells Sephron exactly what's going on. Because they're running out of time, and if anything, like Zephyrin is the only one that they are to really need for this mission to be a success. Troi ends up telling Riker that Zephyrin is nuts, and so Zephyrin just starts to put the jukebox on and just starts dancing. So Troi passes out, and Riker's like, "Oh, okay, well." So we're back to the Enterprise. So we see Picard with Data and Worf with his security team, and they're making their way through the ship. Back and forth, we cut to Worf, we cut to Picard. They make their way through decks on the ship. They end up opening these hatches to further try to make their way to engineering. Eventually, we start to see a deck that is to all of a sudden to have been morphed and changed to look a lot more like the Borg. And that is to be saying, like, okay, we're coming to the right place. Data goes on to tell Picard how he's starting to have feelings of anxiety, and further goes in depth about how he's feeling, and Picard tells Data, "Hey, can you turn off your emotion chip?" Because I love that you're describing all this, but how about you just kind of turn that off? And so Data does. And Picard turns to Data and says, "You know what, Data? I envy you." Just for him to be able to not feel the fear that he's feeling right now. So, Worf goes on to have his security team find this hatch be open and people coming out of it, and we find out that it's none other than Crusher. Crusher goes on to tell Worf that Lily is to be out and about in the ship and she doesn't know what's going on, and hopefully Worf will go on and find Lily. So the next thing we see is Picard make his way to spot a number of Borg in these hallways. The Borg spot Picard and his team, and Picard tells his security crew, bizarrely, to lower their weapons. Because if the Borg does not see them as a threat, they will just ignore them and walk away. So it's kind of different than like how a lot of people are saying that the Borg are like zombies, that as soon as they see like a meal that they go after it. The Borg goes on, it's like, oh, okay, whatever. Like, I'll just walk away then. And that is quite interesting. So we have the crew with Picard and Worf that further go on, and both Picard and Worf both meet together at the engineering room, or at the engineering door. They're trying to go on and open the door manually, and so when Data tries to do so, he ends up breaking the manual opening of the door, to where Picard tells Data, maybe we should just knock. After they try and open the door manually, that's when the Borg start to realize that the Picard and Picard and his team is actually a threat here, and they start going after them. Worf notices one of the Borgs getting out of its regeneration, a cove, and Worf alerts everybody to get their phasers ready. So crewmen start to fire on some of the Borg, and so does Worf. Picard has Data cover for him as he opens up this hatch, this thing, to start to make adjustments, hoping that will go on and help them here. So Worf continues to fire his rifle, and then the Borg start to adapt. They have these shields over their bodies, and Worf yells out that they've adapted. And that seems to be like the go-to phrase that Worf has in this movie. So Worf goes on and takes his rifle, takes it as like a weapon, and just starts beating the Borg with it. I'm like, yeah! One of the Borg try to grab Picard, and Data ends up taking this Borg's neck and snapping it. I'm like, yeah, this is awesome. So the crewmen try to hand-to-hand fight the Borg, and some of the Borg go on and they just fling these guys and crush them. There's one guy that tries to climb on this ladder, and the Borg grabs him and pulls him down, and then climbs the ladder after him. Data goes on to eventually grab one of the Borg and throws the Borg onto other Borg, and I thought that was like the coolest thing. So Yeah, it's enclave or alcove. Alcove. Alcove is the word here. So as further and further fighting goes on here, and more of the Borg start grabbing crew members and start infecting them, the crewmen realize that they have to evacuate this deck and have to just get out of there. They have to find a hatch to go into and escape, because otherwise they're going to get assimilated or they're going to die. Picard, before he leaves the deck, he notices that one of his crewmen is to be calling out for help, and Picard uses his phaser and kills him. Picard goes on and makes his way through this shaft to eventually find Lily, and Lily stops him. Picard tries to talk to Lily, and Lily ends up asking him what faction is he involved in, and Picard mentions that he's not a part of the Eastern Coalition, and Lily starts calling Picard a soldier. So Picard has Lily follow him. So now cut to the engineering. Data has been taken, because eventually while fighting, Data will be grabbed by the leg and thrusted, and is to have disappeared. Data goes on and makes his way to engineering to eventually be tied to this regeneration, a clove or alcove, and is to start to look around. He starts to notice that the Borg is going on and trying to break into the codes, the encrypted codes, and Data goes on to tell the Borg that they're not going to be able to break through that. So eventually, the further and further that Data is talking, at some point the Queen Borg goes on and starts talking back to Data, mentioning how they've gone on to conquer so many species, and this will of course be no different. The Borg go on to drill into Data's mind, or drill into his head. They do that because eventually they want to go on and turn back on his emotion chip, because that'll tie into what they do next by grafting skin onto Data to try and assimilate him. So now we cut back to Earth. Riker has gone on to explain everything to Zephyrin, and so Zephyrin is relaying it back to him with cybernetic creatures from the future who are trying to enslave the human race, and Riker and his team of people are there to stop them. Having Zephyrin say that Riker's story is quite heroic, but I'm not quite sure he exactly buys it. So Zephyrin is to be pulled to this telescope for him to see for himself. Geordi is to go on and look within this telescope to find where the Enterprise is. And so Zephyrin is to follow and look inside of it and see the Enterprise ship. Zephyrin goes on and laughs at the group in front of him here and says that that's a nice trick. And Geordi's like, hey, it's your telescope, not mine. So the further that Zephyrin looks into the telescope, he realizes that there's no trick to be done. And so he has to realize that this has to be true. They go on to also explain to him that Lily is to be on their ship. And Zephyrin wants to go on and communicate with Lily, but Riker says, hey, we've lost contact with the Enterprise, and we don't know why. so I'm sorry you can't speak to her. So Zephyrin ends up going on to ask Riker, Geordi, and Troi here, okay, what's the plan? Like, what do you need from me? Riker goes on to explain that all they need is for Zephyrin to do the same thing that he was going on to do anyways, which was to try and have the Phoenix fly off the way it's supposed to. And so they're going to try and do everything that they can to make that a possibility. For Zephyr's ship to fly past the solar system at 11 a.m. So they also tell Zephyrin that he's going to go on and meet with an alien life form. Zephyrin thinks that, oh, are those going to be bad guys too? And Riker tells him no, they're actually good. Troi goes on to even further say that that of course these being Vulcans have no real interest in Earth, and they say that it's too primitive, because of course it is. So Riker ends up explaining to Zephyrin that what they're going to do here is create first contact with an alien race, and eventually the more and more that they talk, Zephyrin starts to figure out what these guys are to be, and eventually he even comes to the term of Star Trek. And I thought that was kind of funny here. That he kind of figures out everything that's going on and kind of re-explains the Star Trek show to these people, and I thought that was kind of funny. So they end up at the end of all this, end up asking Zephyrin if he's willing to go on and do what they ask of him, and he's like, why not? Like, he has nothing better to do. So, cut back to the Enterprise. We start to see several crewmen that are now getting killed or assimilated into the Borg, because resistance is futile. We're starting to more and more see people from the ship turn into Borg, and it's a really, honestly cool sight here. We start to see that several parts of the ship are to be more Borg adjusted to where people are getting experimented on and getting pieces and parts being put on them, and it's quite an interesting sight here. And people's eyes are getting adjusted to then have like the Borg kind of pieces kind of put on their bodies. So there's a crew that go on and try to make their way into one of these rooms to find out that there are several Borg within inside of it, with all of these kind of laser lights poking out of the dark room. So now we have a crewman that makes his way to the bridge, explaining to Worf what has been going on. We have Worf that is to go on and tell this crewman to make his way back to his people and just continue to report to Worf every 10 minutes. So Picard and Lily make their way through this shaft, and Picard needs to continue to convince Lily who he is and that he's from the future, and that there is a faction that is trying to hurt the people of Earth, and if anything, the Enterprise is there to try and stop that. So Lily is trying to have Picard get her out of here, wherever this is. She wants to leave, and Picard is like, okay, well, I'll go on and I'll help you do that. Picard hits this button and opens up this window and shows her the Earth. he points out Australia and a number of other things on Earth and says, "Hey, all you need to do is just go on and just hold your breath because it's a long way down. But if anything, I'm sure Montana will come up soon." And so Lily goes on and looks at this window and realizes that everything that Picard is probably telling her is actually true. That they're in outer space, and Lily even is confused that this window doesn't even have a reflection. It doesn't look like just a thick piece of glass. And Picard says no, it's actually a force field. And so he touches it, and then the force field kind of just goes off. And Lily's like, "Oh, like I've never seen technology like this." And Picard is like, "Well, yeah, like the technology is well advanced because of course we're from the future." So that convinces Lily of everything. And so Lily goes on and hands Picard her ray gun or her phaser, because she calls it a ray gun. And Picard looks at the phaser and looks at the setting and is like, "Well, yeah, if you would have shot me with this phaser, you would have vaporized me." And Lily's like, "Well, yeah, it's my first ray gun." So Picard goes on and grabs Lily's hand to have her come with him. So back at engineering, we have Worf. We have Data going on and talking to still the Borg Queen voice that's in the background. We'll finally see the Borg Queen, half of her body, making her way down to connect with the other half. So the Borg Queen makes her way to Data, and she says, "I am the Borg." And Data again goes greetings to her. Data thinks that it's unusual that the Borg Queen is saying "I" instead of "we," because Borg don't think of themselves as individuals, they think of themselves as a collective. So Data is to go on and ask the Borg Queen if she is their leader because of how she is to be an individual instead of a collective. We, that the Borg always say. So the Queen Borg just states that she is to be the one that brings order to all the chaos, and that if anything, right now Data is more in chaos than she is for how much of he is to be a machine but wants to be human. And the Queen Borg can go on and figure out a way to help Data try and get to that point. But also Data is fighting with her because he's like, well, his difference compared to her is that Data can go on and evolve where the Borg can't. So, in that Data can always better himself where the Borg can't exactly better themselves. So, that they've kind of reached their glass ceiling and Data hasn't yet. So, we go on to find that the Borg has put flesh onto Data's arm, and it ends up getting revealed. The Queen Borg ends up going on to blow on the human flesh, and Data ends up feeling it and realizes that his emotion chip is to be turned back on. The Queen Borg ends up turning to Data and asks, "Was that good for you?" Cut back to Picard and Lily. Picard is to go on with Lily and go into the details of this ship, explaining how many decks there are, explaining how many feet long things are, and Lily is to, within her own realm of expertise, say how impossible this really is. And Picard is to say, it's like, well, this is to be several years advanced in the future, and money is not a thing anymore, and resources end up coming way easier. And so Lily is to say, wait a minute, you're not even getting paid to do any of this? And Picard, it's like, well, no. Like, if anything, it's just we're always trying to better ourselves. And so, yeah, so money is no longer a thing. So, we have Picard and Lily that meet up with the Borg on one of the decks of the ship. Lily starts freaking out, and Lily had gone on to make a joke when Picard would talk about the Borg, and Lily would say, "Oh, that sounds Swedish." And then eventually, when Lily ends up seeing the Borg herself and realizes, yeah, the Borg aren't Swedish, which was kind of funny. So Lily and Picard are forced to make their way through the ship, and Picard is protecting Lily because Picard knows that that the Borg will not go on and hurt him because he again hears their song. So Picard blocks Lily from these Borg, and they make their way through this area, through this deck. And Picard realizes that he needs to go on, and he needs to get the Borg's attention, so he fires his phaser and then goes on into a holodeck. So Picard goes on and siphons through The Big Goodbye Chapter 12 for this holographic novel. I believe that Picard is to be playing this character called Dix, who is to be this like private eye that I had seen, I think, him play in Star Trek Next Generation at some point before, where I think at some point Picard did get like stuck in a hologram where people were to have gone on and gotten shot and almost killed members of Picard's crew, and so they need to figure out a way to get out of that because something like from time to time things would happen to the holodecks where eventually people would be stuck in the holodecks and kind of captured or stuck in this way of not being able to get out, and no matter how much they call out to the computer, the simulation would not end. So, and the stakes will be raised here. So, because Picard will go on and take all the safety precautions. So we have the Borg that open the door to the holodeck, and they meet up with a guy that is stopping them from getting anywhere further into this bar. We come to find out that the guy that is stopping them is none other than an actor that was involved in Star Trek Voyager, I believe. I think this was to have gone on and been the actor who was the guy who was at the lunchroom or the bar or whatever it is. Like, he basically becomes the new Guinan in Star Trek Voyager. I think that is this guy from memory. But the guy that they have here stopping the Borg is not that exact same guy. It's just the same actor. So he tries to stop the Borg. The Borg end up using their uh, their devices to just scan this hologram and realize that he's fake, and then they just go on. and they get past him. Picard makes his way to a bartender to ask if Nikki the Nose is there, and the bartender says that he hasn't been there in months. So Picard realizes that this is the wrong chapter. Picard calls out for the computer to get to chapter 13, and so now all of a sudden things have changed. Picard and Lily are going on to the dance floor and dancing, and as Lily is frantically just kind of looking around, Picard is telling her to pay attention more to him and to pretend like they're having a good time, even though they aren't. So Picard and Lily are starting to dance here, and the Borgs are starting to come in. Picard realizes that he has to go on and find Nikki the Nose, and he does, and so he goes on to realize that he needs to find possibly a gun that would have real impact on the Borgs, and so Picard and Lily are thrusted to make their way to Nikki the Nose, and a woman named Ruby stops Picard, kisses him, and Picard tells Ruby that he doesn't have time for her. Ruby goes on to say it's like, well, yeah, we never have time for one another, and so Picard tells Ruby that he's working on a case, and so Ruby's like, oh, okay, well, like, if anything, protect your caboose and drop the broad. So Ruby leaves. Picard makes his way to a member sitting next to Nick the Nose and starts patting him down. The guys say, hey, I'll probably get offended with you patting me down in a minute here. And Picard then goes on and finds this instrument case and opens it and realizes that there's a Tommy gun inside of it. Whips it out and starts firing crazily all over the place. So we have Picard who's firing wildly here, and eventually it does go on and hit the Borgs. And the Borgs fall over. Picard is screaming and so Picard then goes on and takes the Tommy gun and is to thrust it into the Borg, and Lily tells Picard, I think you got him. I think he's dead. I think you killed him. But Picard definitely wants to make sure. So Picard starts to thrust through the Borg and starts to try and find a chip of some kind, or a neuroprocessor, or a memory chip, because Picard getting this is to go on and figure out what the Borg's plan is. So Lily, when looking at this Borg body, notices that there's something familiar on it, and she notices the same logo that matches Picard's uniform, and realizes that, hey, this is one of yours. And Picard says, yeah, this was Ensign Lynch. And Lily ends up saying like, oh, well, like, man, that's kind of tough luck. And Picard thinks nothing of it, and he's like, well, hey, we need to go to the bridge. So, because again, Picard realized how battle hardened he needs to be and how just disconnected he has to be. So, even though he spent so much time with all these people, yeah, he just has to go on, and he just has to just go to the next thing and focus on that. But also, that's kind of Picard in this movie, where, like, other people are kind of having problems. Picard has, like, people just kind of focus in on a very specific thing to have them just continue to move on here. So that's honestly the thing that I like about Picard is Picard always gets people on point and gets them to focus on the right things to keep them going. And that's the thing that I always kind of liked about Picard, in my opinion. So, like, regardless of how, like, the chips are down and out, and how a lot of times, like, we would go on to see, like, people being stuck in caves and figuring that they're probably going to die. Oh, there's no way they're going to get out. Like, eventually it's like, hey, let's just keep focusing on what we can control and hope that we're going to get out of here. So Zephyrin goes on and eventually is trying to avoid every one of these Enterprise crewmen because he does not want to go on and shake a number of people's hands and say how happy they are to have met this guy and how much he means to them, because he's really getting annoyed with it. So Zephyrin is having Barclay follow him, and so Zephyrin makes his way to Geordi. Geordi ends up saying that he is looking at these certain numbers, and he's hoping that Zephyrin is going to go on and correct him to see if it's right or not, because Geordi had gone on to remember this stuff in school, and it's been so many years from being in that class and knowing if these numbers are right or not. So Geordi just wants Zephyrin's just confirmation. And Zephyrin looks at it and it's like, you went to school for this? And Geordi's like, well, yeah, I went to Zephyrin Cochran's school and this, that. So Zephyrin looks at it and he's like, all right, like, the numbers, they seem sound. So here's where Barclay interrupts. He goes on to tell Geordi that they have to replace this part, and Barclay wants LaForge's kind of critique if this would be the perfect part to be replaced. Geordi looks at it with his new contact lenses because he doesn't have his visor on anymore, which honestly is the thing that I hated, that they replaced his visor. But I think it's better for the character because, if anything, like Lamar, the guy that was playing Geordi, would say that he could not effing see with the visor on. And so it was very hard for him to be able to go on and be this character when he couldn't freaking see. And it's not like he could go on and, like, look down or anything like that to try to cheat things, because people would notice. People would know that LaForge could not see. So he had to go on and just kind of pretend that he could. Yeah. So and man, like, that is interesting when they focus so much more so on that character, because yeah, like, they're focusing on a character that couldn't see. Like, Geordi even brings up the one episode where he has to go on and fight an entity that isn't really there, as well as also him being, like, in the darkness at night, I think. And so Geordi is or Lamar is to focus on that and say that that was, like, the hardest thing that he ever had to do in the show. And, like, that was like, yeah, like, that makes so much sense. A guy who couldn't see, who's fighting a thing that he doesn't know is really there, and he has to just kind of be guided by his director to hope that what they got was going to go on and be good enough. So LaForge tells Barclay that the item that he's given him is good, and so Barclay is going on and being like a schoolgirl and wanting to just shake Zephyrin's hand and say how important he was to him. So Barclay leaves, and Zephyrin turns to LaForge and is like, God, does everybody have to do that? Like, why is it that everybody is just treat me like some like uh like some historical figure? And so the Forge goes on, and it's like, well, like you just don't get it. Like the Forge goes on to even further explain how Zephyrin is sitting or just standing in the exact spot where a future statue of him is going to get made, and that his hand is be out in the skies. And the Forge then goes on the further and further that Geordi is to be talking about this whole statue thing. Zephyrin goes on to say, "Hey, I'm going to go on and I'm going to take a leak." Geordi says, "What leak? What's going on?" And Zephyrin turns to Geordi. It's like, "Oh, you guys don't pee in your century?" And Geordi's like, "Oh, pee? Yeah, I get what you're saying now." So Zephyrin goes off to the woods to really hide out because he's trying to avoid every one of these goddamn people because he is just so exhausted of hearing all of them just worship him, and he's also just freaking out and probably wanting to run away at this point. So cut to the Enterprise. We have the bridge that is going on and having all these phasers, and a latch is to be opened, and Picard is to be walking out of it, or climbing out of it. Picard turns to Crusher and says, "Hey, I found something you lost." And Lily pokes her head out and sees Worf, and Worf has to explain to her, "Hey, I'm a Klingon. I'm fine." I'm like, because of course Lily has never seen a Klingon in her life. So could you just imagine if Lily is on this Enterprise and every single member of it are all aliens? Could you just imagine that? Like, Lily would be going on and speaking with Picard, and Picard is this drastically crazy looking alien. And yeah, like, that would definitely freak her the out. But also, just looking at simply like a guy like Worf that just has this drastically different forehead, yeah, like, of course, would freak Lily out also. Just like, what the heck? Who that? What? So, uh, anyways, so here's where we go on to have Picard, who is to use the thing that he got from the Borg and explain to the bridge crew what he had figured out. And it seems that the Borg are going to use the ship's deflector disc. You know, the thing that is to be underneath the saucer part of the Enterprise, that is to kind of be like the equivalent of the ship's kind of like belt buckle that like is to be kind of uh, the part of the ship that kind of makes it unique. Anyways, so the deflector disc is to go on and have a beacon to be placed on top of it, so that way the Borg can talk to other Borgs of this time period and be able to uh, connect with them and get quite possibly reinforcements for how the numbers are starting to dwindle. So we would, of course, have Picard that is telling Worf that it's like, well, yeah, we have to go on and stop them from getting to make this beacon from this dish. So Picard ends up asking Worf if he has ever gone on to get zero G training, and Worf has, but if anything, it had made him very sick. But Worf is to ask Picard, it's like, well, hey, why are you asking that? And Picard is like, well, hey, we have to go on and go for a little stroll. because they have to go on and they have to put on these spacesuits and go outside of the ship to try and stop the Borg from turning on this beacon. So now cut back to Earth. Riker and LaForge are trying to figure out where Zephyrin is because he has gone off into the woods to hide out because he's just so sick of hearing about who he is in the future. So LaForge goes on and uses his contact lenses or his eyes to be able to narrow down exactly where Zephyrin is. So, my apologies, my phone went off. I didn't have it on do not disturb, and I probably should have. Maybe I'll pause here just to do that. All right, so cut back to the ship. Picard, Hawk, and Worf are to get in their spacesuits, and so Lily is to go on and tell Picard to protect his caboose, and Picard says he intends to. So all three of the men go on, and they are to be on the underneath part of the ship, but it doesn't really matter, trying to get to the beacon. Picard ends up asking Worf if he's okay, and of course Worf isn't. He's starting to feel sick. Picard ends up telling Worf to just focus on the floor of the ship and nothing else. So the next thing we see is more skin being grafted onto Data's arm. Eventually, the further and further that Data goes on and talks to, of course, the Queen Borg here, the more that they're talking about becoming more human. And eventually, the further and further Data says, as they're talking, that the Borg think that they're perfect, and if anything, to think that is actually just a delusional mind. And that the Queen says small words for small being, which is kind of funny, saying that an android is to be a small being. So Data says that the Borg don't really have a real true interest in him. They just need the encryption codes from him. So they're just trying to manipulate him into doing what they want. And so they don't really care about him. They just want him to be assimilated into their collective so he can just be another one of them. So Data at some point finally does go on and free himself from his shackles and starts to go on and starts attacking the Borg via hand-to-hand combat, which was sweet. Data goes on and just starts taking these Borg out, like kind of like strong-arming them, and it's pretty awesome. So the Queen goes on and eventually activates this force field, and one of the Borg thrash Data's arm, and it's to be the part of the skin where all of a sudden the skin is to be cut, and Data goes down because he is emotionally reacting to the skin being cut, and he is hurt. So the Queen goes on and notices that Data reacted the way he did and tried to protect the flesh that they had just given him. Further that they talk, the Queen is to say, it's like, oh, well, hey, if you don't like the flesh that we had just given you, how about you just rip it off like any other issue that you would ever have with any circuits or anything like that? So Data is tempted to rip off the skin, but then stops himself from doing so. And here is where the Queen ends up asking Data if he has ever had sex before. And Data says, oh. like, well, I'm fully functional in multiple techniques. And the queen ends up asking Data, like, when was the last time he had sex? And Data goes from the exact 8 years, 16 days, 4 minutes, 22 seconds. So the queen ends up saying far too long and kisses him. And then we cut to uh, the three guys out on the ship, magnetizing themselves to it, so that way they can go on and stop the Borg from having this beacon being put on this dish and trying to call out to their others. So they go on and they realize around this dish there is this thing that they need to go on and do to manually replace these certain kind of cards, and then go on and pull out this lever like thing and adjust it to where it manually unlocks the disc or the dish away from the ship. So that is to be their next plan. And eventually what does go on and happen is that Worf, Picard, and Hawk all try to go on and all do this manual release thing, and eventually the Borg start to notice, and so they start to make their way to them. Eventually Hawk will end up being grabbed because he's the odd man out, and he'll be grabbed by the arm and getting pulled away, and then we'll find out that he'll end up getting assimilated into the Borg really quickly, out of all interesting things. So Worf will go on and also be attacked by the Borg, and he'll realize that the Borg have quickly adapted and the rifle is no good. So eventually Worf will pull out this Klingon knife and start facing off against this Borg, cutting its arm. But eventually the Borg will cut through Worf's pant leg, and oxygen will start leaking out of Worf's leg, or Worf's suit. So Picard will go on and eventually face off against the Borg and will fire around the dish, and a Borg will go on and kind of leave off into space, and then another Borg will try to go on after Picard, and Picard will unmagnetize himself to the ship, fly over the Borg, and then get to the spot where Hawk was to manually have that release and then finish it. Because when Hawk was trying to do the manual release, the lever part where he's trying to pull out was stuck. So Picard goes on, does the manual release, and then the dish ends up detaching from the ship, but there is a bit of a wire or a hose that connects this dish to the ship, and the Borg can figure out a way to put the beacon all together, and it's starting to turn on. So the further and further that the dish separates from the ship, we find out that Worf is still alive because he shoots Hawk, who is trying to attack Picard. Worf then goes on and is to take out the dish and say, assimilate this. And so he takes out the dish and destroys the beacon. So, back on Earth, we now have Riker and LaForge chasing after Zephyrin here, and eventually they corner him. They ask if he's still going to the bathroom, and he's not. So, Zephyrin at this point is freaking out, telling everybody that he doesn't want to be a part of their future. He doesn't want to be a statue. And Riker turns to LaForge, like, you told him about the statue? So LaForge, so Zephyrin starts to run away here, and Riker's like, hey, we don't have time for this. And Riker uses his phaser and shoots Zephyrin, and he falls to the ground. because he's stunned. So, man, did I cut through a lot of stuff here. I really did. My apologies. I'm kind of tempted to just pause this here because, yeah, I really cut through a lot of stuff very quickly. So, we make our way into after the dish is to no longer be a part of the ship and the beacon has been destroyed. The Queen Borg goes on and tells the other Borgs that plans have now changed. And we have Riker that turns to Zephyrin and asks if he's okay. Zephyrin ends up explaining that he either has a hangover or he's still affected from the phaser that Riker fired on him. But either way, it's time to make history. They end up opening the missile silo and getting ready to launch the Phoenix. Zephyrin is going on and kind of dodging his eyes because, again, he's just very hungover. So Riker ends up mentioning about the moon. And so this is really telling how different the times are here. Because Zephyrin is to say, hey, you don't have a moon from where you come from. And Riker is like, well, yeah, but it's very much different. If anything, the moon actually has people on it. And so Riker is talking about how many different cities and how many different things there are on the moon now. So Riker ends up saying it's like, well, yeah, you know why all that is to have happened? And Zephyrin is like, yeah, I get it. It's all because of me. Like, God, you people. So Zephyrin goes on and he explains, like, who he really is so Riker can better understand it. Because Zephyrin is to say, it's like, yeah, for all that you people who are to go on and explain who I am in the future, like, I don't know who that guy is. Like, I don't think I'm that guy at all. Zephyrin is to go on and say the only reason why he was to have gone on and done this whatsoever was because of the naked women and the money of a tropical island possibility. That is to be the only thing he's ever wanted. And that's all he gave a shit about. And Riker ends up saying it's like, well, hey, don't be a great man, just be a man. And Zephyrin starts to joke about that and says it's like, well, yeah, that's just nonsense. But then Zephyrin turns to Riker and says, who said that? Because it would sound like something that probably Zephyrin would go on and actually say. And Riker says, yeah, you said it 10 years from now. And so Zephyrин's like, oh, okay. So Riker is to say, it's like, well, hey, like, regardless of who you are, like, at least you do have a vision, and we're sitting in it right now. And so, hey, like, let's do what you set out to do. So I'm hugely paraphrasing this whole entire movie. I want to try to get this done as quickly as I can because I know how long it's going to take because all the details. So my apologies if this isn't word of word. I'm trying to just perfectly poetically rattle this all off. Because it's always really hard to figure out the perfect way to do these reviews sometimes. And try to get them done in a reasonable amount of time. And then also, I'm rattling off nonsense here, so my apologies. Anyways, so we cut to the crewmen making their way back to the bridge and explaining about how now their weapons have become completely useless and that they're firing off blanks. Pleading to Picard that there is no way for them to go on and be able to fight the Borg now. Picard goes on and tells the crew member that he needs to do whatever it takes. If it means that the crew members need to fight hand-to-hand combat, then that's what they need to do. to fight the Borg. So the crewman walks away, and here's where finally Worf says to Picard that they should probably self-destruct the ship, that they should blow it up. Crusher says, hey, if they destroy the ship, they destroy the Borg. And Picard is like, no, we're going to stay and fight. Like, we're not going to lose the Enterprise and let it be sacrificed. So Worf continues to chime in on Picard and finally say that Picard is emotionally compromised here with his experiences with the Borg. And it is starting to affect Picard's judgment. Picard says that Worf is afraid and that he's a coward, and Worf says that he will kill him where he stands if he was not to have been the man he is, and to have been their captain, and has had such a history between the two of them that it makes Worf so hard to want to pull the trigger here. Picard tells Worf to get off my bridge. Get off my bridge, Worf. You. So, make it so, So, Crusher ends up realizing that what Picard is saying is going to be the orders, and Lily is telling Crusher that what Picard is doing is wrong here, and Crusher's like, no, like, Picard says what to do, he's the captain, we're going to follow him. And so Lily follows Picard into this room where he's adjusting this rifle, and Lily goes on to convince him that that fighting the Borg is suicide, and that they should blow up the damn ship. Picard ends up saying that no one knows or understands what it's like to face off against the Borg, and Picard knows how to fight them, and he knows like how to beat them, because at one point he had become a Borg himself, and he had been a part of their collective 6 years ago. And so Lily realizes that Picard had gotten hurt by the Borg, so Picard wants to return the favor, and so he has a vendetta. He wants to seek his revenge. And Picard says, like, well, hey, we don't have things like revenge in my time period. And we have evolved sensibility. Lily goes on to say, hey, I saw you in the holodeck. I saw you murder the Borgs. You even enjoyed it. So, like, it's okay if you're getting a thrill from murdering somebody, because she's seen it at some point before. Because technically, Lily realized that Picard did kill Lynch. He did kill one of his own, Borg or not, because he did not go on and try to save Lynch whatsoever. He just mowed him down. So, the further and further this conversation spirals here, Lily brings up Captain Ahab has to hunt his whale, bringing up Moby Dick. And we would go on to realize that Picard would be, of course, a guy who loves to read, and eventually used to go on and understand what she's saying, because he had read Moby Dick. I don't know what it is with Moby Dick. We've come to find, like, in the Major League movie, the Charlie Sheen Major League film, the baseball movie, at one point the catcher of that movie also has to read Moby Dick because uh, the woman that he's with would say that he had never read it. And so finally, the catcher does go on and read the book and reports back to her that he did actually read it. And so she's like, wait a minute, you actually read that book? He's like, yeah, I read it because you told me about it. You told me to read it. So I did. So Picard understands because he had read the book what Lily is getting at. And Lily is still trying to convince Picard to blow up the ship. And Picard screams no and thrusts his rifle into his little ships that are to be in this kind of glass case. Here's the part that I think best sells you on this movie more so than anything. Picard mentions, and I'm going through this line for line here as best as I can. Picard mentions, I will not sacrifice the Enterprise. We've made too many compromises already, too many retreats. They've invaded our space and we fall back. They assimilate entire worlds and we fall back. Not again. The line must be drawn here. This far, no further. And I will make them pay for what they've done. So, Lily starts to walk off and notices that Picard has broken his little ships to say it's like, well, hey, if you're willing to go on and break this, how is that any different than you breaking your own ship? You're breaking the Enterprise. So, because he's to have broken this other ship in his anger, in his rage against the Borg, so it's kind of like a weird, interesting, just kind of thing here to make Picard realize, hey, if you can break these little ships, why not break his own? So that's also to have Picard realize that he needs to quote basically the Moby Dick thing, the Moby Dick book. And Lily ends up saying to Picard, hey, I never read the book. I just only know things about it. So Picard goes on and re-explains the book to Lily and realized that Ahab at the end of the story would go on to destroy himself and his ship. So Picard goes back onto the bridge and explains to everybody that they are going to go on and they are going to evacuate the ship. And so, like, all right, okay, like, we'll go with this answer now. So the next thing we see is the Phoenix getting to their countdown and making sure and checking that everything is ready. So Picard and all of their people or the crew is starting to evacuate, and Worf, Crusher, and Picard are left to initiate the self-destruct sequence. They have to put in their codes to start this 15-minute silent countdown. So Crusher ends up saying, like, well, yeah, I guess we really didn't have enough time with this ship, but there is always time for them to just go on and build another one. And Picard says, yeah, there's plenty enough letters left on the alphabet. Because, yeah, they keep going on, and they've continued to have so many different enterprises that at this point, like, it really doesn't matter how many times they destroy an enterprise. They're just going to make another one anyways and just slap a letter on it. As well as also, it eventually gets to the point where there's so many different Star Trek shows, and eventually not every single one of the ships are all to be called Enterprise. and some of them are to be called different names and have different things about them. So, which is kind of nice and kind of cool how, like, yeah, like, not all these ships are to be called Enterprise. And yeah, eventually it's like Gene Roddenberry still has like so much to say that, yeah, like, this is still Star Trek, and there's so much about this that is like Star Trek. So if anything, yeah, uh like no matter what they change, no matter what they drastically do, yeah, Gene Roddenberry will still get credit for the show regardless of how long he's passed away. So back to the movie. Picard then needs to pull Worf aside and not exactly say the words, but kind of apologize to Worf here by saying, it's like, you know what, I was wrong about what I said. If anything, Worf, you're the bravest man I know. And Worf does say to Picard he thanks him. So I really like this moment here, because even with strong-willed people like Picard and Worf, like, there is these really tender and sweet moments where like, people will go on and turn to one another and apologize, and they realize how good of a friends they are. And I like that. Like, I think there was a point where, like, Data goes to Worf and apologizes for a mistake that he had made, and uh, they kind of amend one another, and they say, like, well, hey, yeah, like, we just didn't want to hurt our friendship. So if anything, like, let's go on and let's try to uh, kind of let this kind of just be forgotten about. So Picard seems to be the last one on the bridge, and all of a sudden he ends up hearing the word captain from Data off in the distance somewhere. Picard turns and realizes that Data is still alive. So the next thing we see is a countdown starting to happen for the Phoenix, and Sephron realizes that he doesn't have something on him, and they won't be able to launch unless they have it. Come to find out, it's just some disc to play music, and so Sephron ends up finding this disc, putting it in this device, and the music starts playing, and Troi realizes that it's so loud that she thrusts her earpiece away. So the song blasts, and as the Phoenix ends up going off, we have Picard that eventually, like, the further and further they kind of rocket off here, Picard or Riker finally tells, "Hey, could you turn that music down a little bit?" So they go on, and they're now out of Earth's atmosphere. Uh, they now realize that they have to go into separation mode, so that way they can get the warp drive uh, things, like, from out of the ship, so that way they can go on and do what they're meant to do here. So Riker explains to Zephyrin here that the warp core is online. So cut back to the Enterprise. Picard is talking to Lily, and Picard ends up telling Lily that he's giving her this thing to give to her crew on Earth, saying for them to go on and just hide out somewhere in North America, and for them to try and avoid doing anything that will conflict with history. So Lily ends up asking if Picard is actually going to go on and leave the ship. And Picard says that he will leave the ship, but he wants to go on and find his friend. Because the crew would go on and not leave Picard when he had gone on to be assimilated into the Borg. And so Picard feels that he needs to go on and do the same thing, uh, in fairness. So Lily goes on to tell Picard to, like, okay, well then go on and just find your friend. So we see that the Enterprise is having all their escape pods or their shuttles or whatever the cell is to all be thrusted from out of the ship. So Picard goes on to make his way into engineering, and there seems to be Borg that are looking on as he makes his way in there. The Queen goes on to notice Picard and says, "Hey, what's wrong, Locutus? Isn't this to look so familiar to you?" Organic minds are such fragile things. How could you forget me so quickly, Locutus? Uh, we were so close, you and I. Don't you still hear our song? Picard ends up getting flashbacks of him being Locutus and the Queen going on and being ever so intimate to him. Picard goes on and states that he remembers the Queen, and he thought that that ship had gone on to become destroyed. And that's where the Queen says, "Oh, you think in such three-dimensional terms." I really like how this Borg character just dresses everyone down as them not being better than her, how she always is to be just smarter than them. And again, like, I think that also just comes down to, like, resistance is futile and whatever you're gonna do is just pointless to me just because I'm better than you. So the Queen looking at Picard, realizing how small and how insignificant the Locutus is now that he's become back human, and the Queen is to say how she has found a partner that would better understand her. That she is to have gone on and found Data. But Picard is willing to say, hey, like, if you'll just go on and let Data go, I'll take his place. Like, I'm offering myself to you. Because before, uh, when Picard was Locutus, he was not going on and giving himself freely. This time, he's willing to do that now. And Picard could be a way to bridge the gulf between Borg and humanity, and instead of fighting her now, he's willing to join her now. So the Queen goes on and is to let Data out of his regen alcove and welcomes home Locutus. Picard tells Data to leave, and Data refuses. Data goes on and makes his way to the computer and is to adjust the computer to get the main computer functions and unencrypts the codes. Picard tries to tell Data to stop what he's doing, but it's too late. Data turns to the Queen and looks at Picard and tells that Picard will become an excellent drone. It's like, yeah. So the Borgs grab Picard, and we cut to Zephyrin, Riker, and LaForge on the Phoenix. So Riker hopes that they're going to get the attention of the Vulcans by going into warp. Uh, because they're going to break the warp barrier in the next 5 minutes. So Zephyrin goes on and tells them to go into warp speed, and he says the word engage. Both Riker and LaForge turn and like, he said the thing, he said it. And they feel so giddy at this point. So Zephyrin starts to have his ship go off, and the Enterprise, it seems, is following him. Zephyrin starts to freak out because of the ship getting ever so close to him, and Riker's, hey, it's just a send-off. Well, come to find out that the Enterprise is to be taken over by the Borg, and there is to be a Borg, like, weapon of hand going into Picard's face with a blade on it, and the Queen goes on and tells Data to fire torpedoes at the Phoenix to destroy it. So as the torpedoes are going off, the Queen tells Picard that his future has come to an end. Picard continues to watch the screen to see if the ship is able to avoid the torpedoes, and they do. We then have the Queen that turns to Data, realizing that she has been betrayed by Data. Data says resistance is futile, and thrusts his arm into the coolant tank, and Picard now has to realize he has to make his way to higher ground to try to grab these hoses to protect himself. The Queen realizes that she has to need to protect herself also, so she sees Picard, grabs onto his legs, and is holding on for dear life just for survival. After Zephyrin gets out of warp, they eventually do go on and have to make their way back to Earth. Zephyrin realizes how small the Earth is, and Riker says it's going to get a lot bigger. So, cut back to Picard and the Queen Borg hanging on for dear life. Data ends up revealing here that he has now lost all of his human flesh and is grabbing onto the Queen Borg, hoping to pull her off of Picard so the two of them could be thrusted back into the gas here to eventually have the Queen to be killed off. And Data is successful with pulling off the Queen Borg, thrusting her into the gas to eventually get killed here. Picard has the hose of the rope that he is connected to break, and he starts swinging like Tarzan here. Picard finds higher ground and is successful in getting around and avoiding some of the Borg that are starting to get killed off. Because the Borg Queen is getting killed off, so is some of the Borg. Picard gets to a point where he can go on and hit some buttons to have the gas all dissipate from the engineering and get everything back to normal within this room as best as possible. So Picard goes through the engineering to find and make sure if the Queen Borg is dead. And so all that Picard sees is this shell of the Queen's former self, pulls away this head and spine, and breaks it to hope that this is to say that the Queen Borg is dead. Then all of a sudden, Picard notices that Data is still alive, as Data calls out for the captain. Picard ends up asking Data if he's alright, and Data ends up stating that he's kind of sad that the Queen is dead. Data even says that there was a short time where he was kind of convinced to do what she wanted, and Picard ends up asking Data, well, how short of a time? And he says like 0.68 seconds. For a android, that's a lifetime. Or that's an eternity, my bad. So Picard takes Data's hand and they make their way out of the engineering, and Picard goes into his captain's log and says that he's now in April 5th, 2063. He goes on and says that the Phoenix ship was successful again, which is kind of funny. And that the Vulcans had found the warp signature of Zephyrin's ship, and that they are going to go on and make history with First Contact. So the Vulcan ship does land onto Earth, and all the humans are going on and seeing this Vulcan ship land for the very first time. As the Vulcans get out of the ship, Zephyrin is just kind of like, I don't know what to do. Riker turns to Zephyrin and tells him, hey, they want to go on and find out who was the captain of that ship, and you're the guy, so go over there and meet with them. So Zephyrin goes on and does so after holding the hand briefly of Lily. The Vulcan meets Zephyrin and ends up telling him, hey, live long and prosper, because basically that seems to be the thing that Vulcans tend to say quite a bit. Zephyrin cannot go on and figure out how to do the hand thing. Because, yeah, Kirk had that problem also, which was kind of ironic. So, Zephyrin goes on, instead of doing the live long and prosper thing, instead he goes on and pulls out his hand for handshake, and he tells the Vulcan thanks. So, Picard ends up appearing in front, Picard ends up appearing in front of Riker, and so that signifies that it's time for this team to get the heck out of there. Riker goes on and says that it's time for them to beam up, and Picard ends up speaking with Lily one last time, saying that he envies her. That eventually Lily is going to be the start of these very first steps, and go into a new frontier, and that also Picard will miss her. And so he walks away. So Picard energizes with the rest of his crew and makes his way back onto the ship. So Picard and his team here are to try to figure out how to use time travel to make their way back into their current time. And because the Forge has figured out how to use the chronometric thing of the Borg spear to figure out how time travel works. So Picard goes on and says, okay, make our course to the 21st century. I suspect our future is there waiting for us. Course laid in. So, and Picard is like, make it so. So, Enterprise goes on through the time portal and gets back to their current time. Lily looks on as the ship leaves. And now we just go on and see that Zephyrin is with the Vulcan at a bar, and they're dancing. Well, Zephyrin is dancing, and the Vulcan is just drinking alcohol and very confused. And that's how they end the film. And I'm going to get that out of here to make this review very much shorter. I was worried that this one was going to take like 3 hours, and I was glad that it at least got under 3. So I'm happy about that. Even though still, I'm sure a lot of people can say that this is too long. If anything, with Star Trek, there is way too much detail. Kind of like how Power Rangers has the same thing, where there's way too many weapons and there's way too many sequences, and there's a lot of things to just break down. Everything has its very specific name. But if anything, luckily, I am to go on and have a bit of knowledge enough of Star Trek to be able to know all these names of these things and be able to just easily say them instead of being brand new to all this, where I'm just like, what are shields? What is a bridge? What is a red alert? What is a yellow alert? I don't know what any of this stuff is. No, I know exactly what it all is because I've just been so tied to Star Trek for so long that it's just kind of nice to, because I've gone on to see quite a bit of every title of Star Trek, even the more current modern stuff, and I'm like, like I'll go on to probably say that Star Trek Next Generation was the series that I kind of grew up on, and yeah, like I have seen other things. I've seen OTS or TOS, the original series with Spock and Kirk and all them, and I've seen all the movies. I've kind of seen pretty much everything, even Starfleet Academy. So, and even I think I've seen kind of briefly some stuff of Lower Decks, even though a lot of Lower Decks is just kind of like, what the is this? It's kind of a joke. But eventually, Lower Decks ends up getting used in other Star Trek things, which I'm like, okay, that's not really helping that whatever that show is. Then ends up getting a crossover of it, but whatever. I guess it is what it is. So, but eventually, at some point, like, I am to want to figure out what is to be the most popular thing of Star Trek, and if it ends up being Star Trek Next Generation, that's where I'm going to jump off at. Plus, also, I was kind of questioning whether or not I should go on and survey people to see what they wanted to see on this channel. But also, I just wanted to just start this off to see what was actually to be popular on YouTube before further going on and question anybody and be like, oh yeah, like let's do this. Da, 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 da. Like I want to see what actually is popular on YouTube before actually going on and further than deciding what to do, honestly. So with that said, hopefully something of Star Trek is popular on this platform because I will hopefully be able to go on to justify covering more of it. I don't know what exactly tags I'm going to use that connects to all this, but in all honesty, this movie does connect to a lot of number of different Star Trek seasons. So, if anything, yeah, hopefully there'll be something that is popular from Star Trek. I think I did go on and use Star Trek as a tag once, but if anything, I don't think it really went anywhere just because it's like, okay, well, this isn't exactly a Star Trek thing, but this is a Star Trek thing, so we'll see where this goes. So, with that said, I'm going to get that out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.